Hello everyone, it's Marc Sabatella from Mastering MuseScore here. Welcome to the Music Masterclass. This is my weekly series where we talk about creating music. We talk about composition, improvisation, arranging, harmony, playing by ear, all sorts of aspects of the music creation process. Hopefully, technical issues won't plague us today. I honestly don't really know what was going on with the sound yesterday. I still haven't been able to pinpoint it because the symptoms were weird. They're not the usual symptoms of the usual problems that I know can happen. So I honestly don't know what's going on. But hopefully today's better. I did check my internet connection. It is solid and fast. So let's get going here. And we have kind of one main focus today, and that's going to be looking at the projects that were submitted as part of the Harmony and Chord Progressions course, and in particular, project number 5, which has to do with reharmonizing a song. Or even, reharmonizing implies that we even had harmonies to begin with. Now, we're taking melodies and then creating harmonies to fit those melodies within a certain set of constraints. And so we're going to be gradually, looking at different constraints here. So what I'm going to do is I've got like a whole bunch of these pieces that people have uploaded that I want to look at. And I'll tell you what I'm going to look at first is the piece that I actually did, the Ash Grove, and just do a quick recap of what I did. And then we'll talk about the bridge, which is the part I didn't do, and look at how people handled that. And then I'll talk about how I might have handled it. And then we'll look at some of the other pieces that people have submitted. Before I get underway with that, actually, I'm going to play my version here for anyone who hasn't gone through it and known what we're talking about. I think these here, Kevin McDonald, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think your first 4 chords, your first 8 bars are my 8 bars, right? So I'm just going to play what I see here, and I will zoom in a bit so we can all see it better. There we go. So we're going to be looking at these first 8 bars. All right, those are the chords that I put together in my demonstration. And in my demonstration, I walked through a process and of how I went about doing it. And so I want to talk a little bit about this process and give you, I want you to hold a couple of conflicting ideas in your head, all right? So these are going to be 2 conflicting ideas that are both true, all right? One of them is there is no process. There is no guaranteed formula to follow, and if you follow that formula, you get good chords. That doesn't exist, all right? That is a true statement. Keep that in your head. Also, keep in your head the following true statement. There is a process that if you follow, you're pretty likely to get some good results, or at least find out what's likely to work and not work. So you understand the difference between these statements? I'm not telling you there is a process guaranteed to always give you good answers, but I am telling you there is a process that is the process that's likely to lead to the best answers that you're going to get, I don't know, following that process. There are good answers that you will get following a process, or you will discover that, what doesn't work. So those are 2 conflicting thoughts that I want you to keep in mind. So my quick recap of what I did in my demonstration was starting with something much simpler. It was this. Something like that, right? It was just 1, 1, and then 5, 7, and then back to 1, and then 4, and then 1, 5, 1. That was my original harmonization. And so what I did from that was look at opportunities to exploit the circle of fifths primarily. So for instance, the bars 3 and 4, where all I had was 2 bars of the 5 chord, I split that up into a 2-5. That's that whole thing that I posted, that I shared with everyone in the newsletter this week of anything 5 can do, 2-5 can do better. Is all 5, but is a 2-5, and it fits really well here. Now, it doesn't always fit the melody that well, in which case, okay, you might not want to use it, but it fits the melody fabulously here. So that's the first step of me thinking about the circle of fifths, is thinking about getting 2 5s in there. But the next step is to back up on that circle and see, well, can I get to that 2 using a 6? Can I get to that 6 using a 3? And in this case, here's my 2 chord in bar, in that 3rd bar. That was a 2 chord, and I was able to put the 6 chord before it. And it works beautifully with the melody. They're all chord tones. So I was able to get 6, 2, 5. Lovely circle of fifths progression there, right? And then the other small change I made, well, I made a couple other small changes, but one of them was replacing 4 with 2. Why? Because I can. I'm not saying it's better, but it's an option, and I want us exploring options. So exploiting the circle of fifths was one thing I did, and exploiting those sorts of substitutions, 2 instead of 4, 3 instead of 1. Those are the functional substitutions that I discuss in the course. And so that's what I did. So I'm going to take a look now at Kevin's version of the bridge here, and we're going to play it. Oh, you did some fancy stuff in the second A section. I'm going to go ahead and listen to that, but we're going to focus a little more on the bridge. But your second A section, you've started to make some modifications. You kept the first 4 bars the same and then made other changes. And I know this is your second cut at it, and I had commented already on the first. So here we go. All right, I'm going to pause there. So you've definitely found some nice chords here that fit the melody. And I think the MuseScore voicings of those chords is letting us down a little bit, because MuseScore's voice leading algorithm isn't really an algorithm. It's just going to try to force all the notes into this octave from middle C on up, or basically from here to here. It's going to force fit all the notes into there and then play a bass note down there. And sometimes it creates bad voice leading as a result. Like leading tones not resolving and that sort of thing. Yeah, the chords basically work with the melody. I'm going to take a little deeper look in a second. But now I'm going to give you another conundrum. What's the word for that when you have 2 conflicting ideas that you have to hold in your head at the same time? There's a term for that that's escaping me. Someone can maybe help with that. The term for when you're trying to hold 2 conflicting thoughts in your head. So here are the 2 conflicting thoughts. Again, both of them are true. One of them is, for diatonic chords, if it fits the melody, it's good. Dilemma, yeah, that's one. I feel like dichotomy. I think that's the word I'm thinking. Dichotomy feels good. Headache is definitely good too. But I think, Nicholas, dichotomy is the word I'm thinking of, I think. In any case, so thought number 1 here is, for diatonic chords, if it fits the melody, it's good. It doesn't need more explanation than that. When we start talking about non-diatonic chords, that changes. When we talk about non-diatonic chords, it's, yeah, we're going to want a better reason than it kind of fits the melody. Those chords are going to sound random if they don't follow certain principles. And so that's why I'm really spending a lot of time at the beginning thinking of, just sticking with diatonic chords so we can wrap our brain around some basic concepts here. Because when we start dealing with non-diatonic chords, the rules are going to narrow some. And rules, yeah, you know what I mean. Rules, law of gravity rules. The things that tell you what's likely to sound good is going to get narrower. But as long as we're talking about diatonic chords, Yeah, for the most part, if it feels like it fits the melody, it's going to be okay. The only trick will be making sure the voice leading is okay to make sure it sounds okay. So I'm going to take this and play a little bit around with it voice leading wise. So I said there's going to be a dichotomy here, two conflicting thoughts to keep in our head. One of them is, if a diatonic chord fits the melody, you don't need any more explanation than that. It's okay. But here's the conflicting thought. Notice how I shift so that I'm doing the thing. Last night I watched the Star Trek episode about the mirror universe, and they do that. They show the Enterprise coming this way and then the Enterprise going that way. That's how you know which universe you're in. So any diatonic chord, if it fits the melody, is okay. But also, diatonic chords really like to obey these principles of following the circle of fifths and obeying function. If we're in a place where we're expecting tonic function, then another chord that fits tonic function is going to sound good there. Other chords won't sound as good. So these are both true statements. You can get away with any diatonic chord at any time if it fits the melody. Absolutely. And yet, there are principles we want to follow. So looking at Kevin's bridge here, I'm going to play it on the piano here. He has a D chord at the beginning. And first of all, let me just think about this. I could have harmonized that whole thing with just that D chord, right? And this is one reason why I was asking people to first post a version where all you do is have the 1, 4, and 5. So I can see kind of your starting point for elaboration, just like I did with the A section. I showed you my 1, 4, and 5 version, and then I showed you how I got from there to the other things. I want you following that same type of process. Don't just like do the 1, 4, and 5 thing, then throw it away and put in new chords. No, I want you to see how to take your basic structure and flesh it out. Because if your basic structure was sound, then the things that you do as a result of this process will be good. So I'm going to assume that that Kevin basically had that. I don't really know. But then he has a G chord here and then a C chord there. Now that all fits, right? This fits, and then he has a C chord. And this all fits the melody, right? D over that D chord fits, and then a C with a G in the bass. This is a appoggiatura, an accented on the beat non-chord tone that resolves by step, passing tone, chord tone. Chord tone on the G, chord tone here, and then the B is a neighbor tone coming up to the A, right? All of those notes fit absolutely positively. So the chords work with the melody. So if I voice lead everything well, it should sound good. Now, the issue that I'm going to have here, and Kevin, inversions is what I'm wondering about, where these inversions are coming from. Because what's happening is you've actually made the bass line considerably jumpier than it might have been. Like if you had gone just playing roots, that would have been no less jumpy than what you have. But if you wanted to put in inversions, and at this rate of change where the chords are changing twice per bar in 3, 4, inversions are a good idea. I would be looking at inversions for the one reason and one reason only, to improve the bass line. So I'm looking for stepwise. What if it was this? Oops. So I'm playing D chord, C in root position. I'm keeping your G with a B in the bass, and then going straight to the C chord in root position again. And now the bass got to go bum, 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 bum. Nice stepwise motion. That is the reason to use inversions when we're dealing with this. There could be other reasons, but for the purpose of what we're doing here, the main reason we would ever use an inversion is to improve the bass line. And by improve, specifically, I mean make it stepwise. So that's something I would be doing, is like re-looking at your inversions. Now here, that's lovely. So this is 2, 5, And in this case, I'm not feeling the need for the inversions. The thing is, anytime you're following the circle of fifths, as far as the chords are going, I expect the bass to be moving by fifth, and it doesn't bother me. Now, you could certainly go. That's kind of nice too, right? Play the 2 chord in root position, and then play the 5 chord in first inversion. And then the bass only has to go ba-da-da-dum. So that's a thing. Oh, you're trying to make a little motif. Well, that's okay. That's a fine thought. I would say don't try that, because that's going to obscure our thinking about the harmony itself. And I really want to focus on the chord function more so than the bass line. The bass line can, be a nice addition too, but if it becomes a distraction, it's not going to do us any favors. So I would say resist. There's certain urges I want us to resist, and that's one of them. Okay. So, but I see where you're going. Bum, 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 bum. That is a cool line. Absolutely, Kevin. I grant that. I missed it, but boo-dum, boo-dum. That's a nice little line. But what if those were the actual roots of the chords? Let's see. Right? That would have been nice too. And typically, when we're seeing bass notes moving in fifth, it's because they're the roots of the chords. And boom, 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 boom. That would be a really lovely bass line if those were the roots of the chords. And I'd actually like that a lot too. So sometimes when you're hearing something in a voice leading perspective like that, it's really telling you something you didn't realize about the chords, that maybe the chords could be a little different than you were imagining them being. All right, so anyhow, this 2-5-1, if I put that 5 chord in first inversion like that, it does smooth out that bass line. So it's not this, it's boom, bum, bum. And that's a common technique. I would not do that like at a final cadence, but for an interior cadence like this, somewhere in the middle of that bridge, absolutely. That idea that we want to weaken that cadence, not making it be this really final 2-5-1, but this version of it could be fine. Also, playing that A chord in an inversion, in first inversion specifically, is totally fine also. So those are both common things, to play either the 5 chord or the 2 chord in first inversion to get a somewhat better bass line out of it. And again, you do that when it feels right to your ears. But the idea of the 2-5-1, rock solid. I do want to mention something about that G5. I know what you're calling for here. So you're concerned that if someone plays a G triad here and you put that C against it, that it's going to be dissonant. And you're absolutely right about that. I'm gonna tell you, I'm going to suggest you not use that notation, G5. It's meaningful to guitar players in a rock context. It means basically play an open chord like that. Basically play an open fifth is what G5 indicates for people who aren't familiar with that chord symbol. It's not very commonly used outside the world of rock. And so it seems a little out of place in something like this. So let's think about what's actually happening here. If you play a G and a D and put a C in the melody, what you really have is this chord here, which we would call G sus. So we would write G sus, not Jesus, but G sus to G. So I would write G sus or G sus 4 followed by G. That would be the usual way to indicate that sort of thing. Oh yeah, and I would assume that that G5 is sometimes called a power chord when you just play the root and fifth like that, and it's common in rock because get really muddy really fast, and if you try to play a complex jazz voicing with distortion, it sounds just terrible because the overtones conflict with each other. So perfect fifths sound really good. Even with distortion, they work really well. So that's why that sound is really popular for rock guitar, distorted rock guitar. For ukulele, it becomes popular simply because you only got 4 strings and none of them, and you are a little bit limited in what you can do, so that sometimes you end up playing some chords that are a little simplified versions of other chords. So G sus, it's G5 is literally these two notes, but the reason you're asking for G5 is because of that C in the melody, and I hear you. You're on the right track there. So I would have called that G sus and then G. But here is the other thing to think about. Here's the other thing to think about. So G 4-3. Yes, you can totally do that. If you write G 4-3, people will figure that out. So the thing is, when you have to think about the different ways these chord symbols are likely to be used and interpreted. The idea that we're restriking the G, that's not necessarily, if I'm arpeggiating my accompaniment, then I would still want to know when to change from that sus to the triad, and I'm not restriking, I'm arpeggiating, right? So if I'm playing an arpeggiated accompaniment, I still want to know when that chord changes. Don't think of it in terms of it means that I'm strumming a guitar or playing a block chord on the piano. So don't think of that as necessarily a downside that you're telling people to restrike the chord, because they're not necessarily. But that said, yes, G 4-3 is pretty clear. And if anyone had any doubt about when to change from the fourth to the third, the melody tells them that. So don't worry about that. By the way, before I forget, when we're in 3-4, every time we have this situation, two chords in a measure, we're going to have to decide, is it one beat of one chord, two beats of the next, or is it two beats of this one beat of that one, or do we split the difference and bring that chord in on the and of two? And they're all valid choices. So I'm going to play what you wrote here. I did something a little different that I'm going to come back to, but so that's what you wrote with the D7 on 3. It could have been, right? Could have been the D on 2. I would say the D on beat 3, or in general, putting that chord on beat 3 is the more common thing that will work more often. But in a jazz context, especially, would be very likely to play that on the and. Right, that is a common thing also. And yes, Allison is absolutely right. If you're trying to do figured bass realization, then we want to know exactly, or anything where you're trying to write out accompaniment, knowing when that chord changes is really important. But I do think you can figure it out by looking at the melody, so it wouldn't necessarily bother me. So the thing that I just did, though, I played C and harmonized it with a sixth blow. This is the oldest trick in the, that's not the old, yeah, it's old. It's an old trick anyhow. What is it? It's a 1-6-4 chord. I mean, a 4-6-4 chord. This is a C chord in second inversion resolving to G. That is a really common way of handling that exact situation, 4 resolving to 3 over the 1 chord. Where we recognize that that is an avoid tone and we don't want it. So one choice is to make a sus chord out of it. The other is to make it a 4-6-4, 4 chord in second inversion coming down here. And this idea of voicing the melody harmonized in sixths, oh my God, it's so powerful. In fact, okay, I was just thinking about this the other day because for some reason, the song Forever in Blue Jeans. Anyone remember that song, Neil Diamond, back in the 70s or 80s? And I just remember it going something like this. And I just remember that was one of the first pop songs I learned to play on the piano, and that rolling octaves trick. It turns it's in a million other songs, but I think it was the first time I encountered this idea of voicing a melody in parallel sixths like that on a consistent basis. And I realized it's a powerful technique, and it gives rise to that 4-6-4 sound. All right, so that's what's going on there. Then going to 6 down here sounds lovely. I love that. And then 2. 6 going to 2 is always nice. Then having 2 go directly to 3 is a little unusual, but again, it fits the chord. And then you've got this C chord in inversion, and here again, I'm not sure what that is buying us over root position, because that would have been stepwise, but probably you were hearing a melody in the bass. Now you're using a diminished chord here, which, you know, we haven't really talked about diminished chords, but diminished chords are basically substitutes for 5. I guess that is what we said. That's a substitute for D7. So by writing it as a diminished chord, it sounds like a D7, but without the D. The D in the melody is going to make it sound like a D. So we're not necessarily getting a lot of diminishedness out of it because of the fact that the melody is filling it. We might as well just call it D7 over A. And then you've got this nice sound. Oh, and I love how that's some voice leading, right? It's some nice voice leading there. And this chord, the E minor 6th chord, this chord is also basically C sharp half diminished as far as that goes. So we'll learn more about that chord a little more on, but it totally works because C sharp half diminished, we'll learn, does like to go to D. Oh, Colleen, I'm so sorry. I forgot to, I was going to get to your piece before you left, but we'll come to it. So sorry about that. But I definitely wanted to talk about Ash Grove first because that was the one I know everyone had looked at, and I wanted to make sure that we got to all see this this one here. So yeah, these are really nice chords here. I am going to go through and talk about what I would have done so that we can look at that, and then you can kind of compare, so everyone else working on this can compare notes. I probably would have looked at it coming back to my 1, 4, and 5. 2 bars of 1, 2 bars of 5, 2 bars of 1, 2 bars of 5, right? That is the simplistic version of this. 2 bars of 1, 2 bars of 5, 2 bars of 1, 2 bars of 5. That would have been my starting point. And then, well, if you think about it, that idea, 2 bars of 1, 2 bars of 5, that's the same thing that I started the piece with. 2 bars of 1, 2 bars, 5. So I would wonder right away if the exact same thing wasn't going to work. Just splitting up that, this 2 bars of 5 into a 2-5. And I would have gone with that, right? And then I would have said, hey, let's back up on the circle of fifths. What if I put in front of that 2, put a 6? And said, yeah, that works okay. I'm not crazy about the C in the melody there, but it's only 1 beat in the middle of the measure. And then I would have backed up on the circle of fifths a little more and said, what if I went back to 3? So this was going to be 3, 6, 2, 5, the entire circle of fifths chain. I mean, it's possible to construct longer ones, but that is our basic unit of primary chords, not primary, diatonic chords following the circle of fifths. So 3, 6, 2, 5 is like, if you can make it work over 3, 6, 2, 5, your work is done. So that works. I'm not crazy. I'm not crazy about landing on the 7th of this chord and then moving through a non-chord tone and coming down here. So I'm not crazy about that, but I like everything else about it. 3 sounds beautiful. This maybe not. So maybe I do something different. And just wait to resolve it, right? 3 and then wait until here to get to my 6th chord. That's a possibility. Or what if I start on my 1 chord? Then 3, 6, 2. Haha. I'm liking that one a lot. I didn't love starting on the 1 chord because I get tired of starting on the 1 chord all the time. But if it made my life a little better, that would make me perfectly happy. But I also like, once I establish that 2 chords per rhythm, 2 chords per measure harmonic rhythm, then going on to that's nice. So I'll take the first part of mine and the second part of Kevin's as like the way to go. And then I love starting the next phrase on the 6th chord. And then I kind of want to say, well, gee, if I'm starting on that 6th chord, and I know I was originally trying to get to a 5 chord there, why not go 6, 2, and put a 2 in this bar here, and how that works. So that's probably what I would have done. 6, 2, 5. So following the circle of fifths there. This is what I mean about, if it fits the melody, it's good. And so you don't really have to worry about circle of fifths and stuff like that. On the other hand, if you can make it fit the circle of fifths and be happy with it, go for it, because it's going to have a certain satisfying quality to it. So yeah, so this was a great example, Kevin. I think you did a great job of filling this in and making your chords fit the melody, and there was some nice use of inversions in some places, especially that line, which I'm just totally in love with. Just love that line. So and it would be different chords you could put there also, but because I could have done that with my D chord, and then because this note here, C sharp, is out of the key, right? We really could be using a non-diatonic chord there. I'm holding off until next week to talk about non-diatonic chords. So so yeah, really good job on that. And so yeah, I'm going to move on now and talk about some other pieces. I know you did a lot of other interesting things here in your treatment of the A section there also, but I'll address that in comments. But in the community. So what I want to do next is take a look at a couple other pieces then that people have submitted. And so there's all sorts of pieces that people have submitted on this, and I'm going to take a look at a couple. So Graham, I haven't looked at your piece yet. It's in a minor key, so I'm going to briefly talk about this and why I'm going to talk about a little bit about why I suggested not using minor key pieces for this project. So, okay. So I've only heard the song a couple times, so I don't know it super well, and I have no concept of what chords I've ever heard with it, and I'm sight reading and kind of fumbling through, so sorry about that. But here's my observation about minor key pieces. There's 2 of them. So I love that this is an A minor. It's going to make it really easy to talk about. Remember how I said in major keys 3, 6, 2, 5 is your friend, right? In the major key, in the key of C, 3 to 6 to 2 to 5 to 1 all follows the circle of fifths. 3 down a fifth to 6, down a fifth to 2, down a fifth to 5, down a fifth to 1. Right? So that's totally following the circle of fifths in a major key, 3, 6, 2, 5, 1. Not only that, not only do they totally follow the circle of fifths, but look at the chord qualities. My 3 chord is a minor 7th chord. It has that minor 7th interval between the root and 7th. Those are the chords that are the most strongly affected by the circle of fifths. Chords that have a minor 7th interval in them, basically minor 7th chords, half diminished chords, and dominant 7th chords. Those are the chords that most want to follow the circle of fifths. That dissonance wants to resolve this way. Major 7th chords, C chord, it gets happy to go to F, but this dissonance here actually wants to resolve up. So this chord is more stable. Major 7th chords are more stable, and certainly triads are inherently stable. But that 3 chord naturally wants to take a seventh, and it's a minor seventh interval above the root, minor seventh chord. That really wants to follow the circle of fifths. So we end up with not only circle of fifths, but circle of fifths involving chords that are dying to use the circle of fifths. Let's contrast it with minor keys. In a minor key, scale degree 3 is C. It's a triad. If I put a seventh on it, it's a major seventh chord, not subject to the circle of fifths so much. And yes, I can go from scale degree 3 or flat 3, I call it, right? You've all seen that. I call my scale degrees in minor keys flat 3 to differentiate it, because I normally think of scale degree 3 as a C sharp. I label my scale degrees in minor keys relative to the major scale, and the main reason for that is to avoid any confusion about which sixth or which seventh do I mean. Harmonic minor, melodic minor, whatever. There's different, you can have either sixth or either seventh in a minor key, depending on context. So to avoid that confusion, I generally refer to this as scale degree flat 3. So anyhow, scale degree flat 3 would have a major seventh if I were to put a seventh on it, and that doesn't really want to go to 6. I mean, it's happy to go there, but it doesn't have as strong a pull. And then this chord also, if we tried to put a seventh on it, is E, which doesn't pull down the circle of fifths. So if I play a plain triad, I can certainly go to F, but it's not as strong as 3 to 6 is in a major key, because we don't have that minor seventh. So triad to triad, it is the circle of fifths, but it doesn't have that minor seventh interval going on. Then the 2 chord is this. Well, that's not a perfect fifth from here. There's a tritone from there, right? So getting from scale degree flat 6 to scale degree 2 breaks the circle of fifths. Yes, it's a fifth, but it's a diminished fifth, depending on which direction you go. It's either a diminished fifth or an augmented fourth, right? So it's not a perfect fifth. So we break the circle of fifths there. So, and then we have that issue of the leading tone, wanting perhaps that leading tone and wondering, well, when are we going to have that leading tone, and what happens if the leading tone is in the melody versus not in the melody? Here's some G naturals there. This song doesn't have any G sharps in the melody, and that's because it comes from an era, I suspect, comes from an era before the leading tone was as accepted as it is now. You know, early Renaissance, pre-Renaissance. Leading tones became common and accepted, but they were not as like just built into the music in early Renaissance music the way that it eventually became. And so a lot of traditional folk melodies don't have that leading tone, and so they never give us an opportunity to really necessarily use the 5 chord. You have to invent opportunities to use the 5 chord. So these are the reasons why I suggested not using minor key songs for this, because almost everything that I actually talked about in the demonstration will require compromises. It's possible to do this same sort of thing in minor keys, but I'd need to go through different demonstrations on it. So anyhow, that's the words that I wanted to say about the minor key. That said, you've made some lovely choices here. You did manage, you managed to get a 5 chord in here, going from here to there, right? A minor with a C in the bass, going to A minor in root position. Now, here's the thing. Under normal circumstances, I would have wanted to reverse that. I would have wanted to start in root position and then come to the inversion later on. But I see exactly why you didn't. I see exactly why you didn't do that, because your melody is also starting on A and going up to C. So you would have ended up having the bass line just follow the melody. So you have a contrary motion in your bass line, which is great. It's definitely an improvement. But it means the piece now is starting on an inversion, which is fine. It's just maybe a little unusual. But I think it's probably the right call for what you've done here. That motion, by the way, using inversions or to smooth out bass lines, I do want to come back to Kevin's version here just to point out one other opportunity. Right here, where we had are you all hearing what I'm hearing here? I don't know. putting in a D chord underneath the A in this melody. And I'm putting it in an inversion, so my bass line can go ba, ba, da, da. Right? That's stepwise motion. As a way of getting from 1 to 6, it's going to work every time. I mean, yeah, maybe depending on what the melody is, but usually that melody is going to be very strong and support that. Anytime you're trying to get from 1 to 6, probably your melody is doing something that supports putting that 5 chord there. So that's a very common technique. And then we end up having 5 resolving to 6, which is, you know, a deceptive resolution. It's like a little cadence there. It's like a little 5 to 1, but instead of resolving to 1, we're resolving to 6. So anyhow, that was something else that I had noticed and was going to comment on and forgot about. All right. I'm going to flip over to someone who's doing a different piece here. And Glenn, I haven't listened to your Oh Susanna. I'm going to take a quick listen, but since I can't see the sheet music, depending on what I hear, I might just move on quickly. But I do want to hear it. I'd love to hear it, but I'm not hearing it. Come on, play. Okay. I got a little confused because the melody was, you know, a different pitch than I was expecting it to be. So that's like is a different. So when he says a little different, he's not kidding. It's a different song, really. So I am going to skip that and come back to it. But I want to look at Kevin's look for the silver lining here, because this is a song that, you know, is a rather more modern song than the ones we're looking for, but it works quite well with just 1, 4, and 5, and then with certain kinds of reharmonizations here. So we're going to take a look at another Kevin here. This is Kevin Johnson. This is his 1, 4, 5 version. All right, so I'm going to stop there and make a couple observations. So this song, although I think of this song as being really, really old, it's not as old as I think it is, right? It's within the last 100 years or so. It's still under copyright almost certainly, which one reason why I'm looking at using folk songs and children's songs and things like that is to avoid any sort of copyright concerns about, like, is YouTube going to flag these videos or whatever. But I'm not really too concerned for what we're doing here. I'm not like overly concerned about that. But the other thing is, as soon as we enter the realm of 20th century composers writing music, they are writing music deliberately knowing they're going to be using additional harmonies, non-diatonic chords, above and beyond diatonic chords. A lot of folk melodies really are intended to just be diatonic chords also. Or they weren't thinking about chords, but they're just natural fits. But songs from the last 100 years or so, it's going to be kind of a given that a lot of them are designed around non-diatonic chords. And it's going to sound a little funny to our ears to hear those songs reduced down to just 1, 4, and 5. So, I mean, to me, that kind of works, but it is a little like my brain had to spin around a little bit. If you're not familiar with the song, maybe it didn't sound strange. And to be honest, I'm not super familiar with the song. I mean, I've heard it before, but I don't think I've ever played it before. So I've never really thought through what chords I would be using. I just know that the 1, 4, 5 simplification of it struck me as a little unusual. So we're now going to hear what Kevin did with it. Nice. Nice. Lovely. All right. So yeah, great job, Kevin. You definitely found you did a great job of filling in chords that ended up reminding me of what I expected to hear. I think some of your like minor 6 chords probably in the original are dominant 7/6 chords and so forth. Maybe not that one, but maybe this one. And so there are certain places where you are able to use a diatonic chord, even though the original probably used a non-diatonic one. So I'm just going to go through this and make a few observations here. This 1 and then 2, 5, right? That's just a nice expansion of that 5 into a 2/5, totally by the book. And then instead of resolving to 1, like the original, he says, hey, I'm going to go to 6. It's a substitution. And it is. It's really nice. Right? Going to 6 instead of 1. As a completely subjective thing to think about, I mean, that is a beautiful technique. 2/5 going to 6 instead of going to 1. It's the textbook example of a deceptive cadence. One thing to consider is, where do we want to use our deceptive cadences? Is this a little early in the piece for that sound? Or would it be better on the second time that melody comes back, because it comes back 8 bars later or 16 bars later, and maybe that would have been, because he actually has it going back to 1 at the midpoint there of the song, bar 17, 18, 19, I guess, of the song. I might have done it the other way around. And let the first one go to 1 and then let the deception happen later. These are like subjective calls you can make. But I do like the idea of softening cadences. I've used that term a few times this past week or two, softening a cadence, not having a root position 5 to a root position 1 chord, a perfect authentic cadence, to use the classical term for it. Here's what I might have done there. Just gone to 1 in first inversion. That softens it up a little bit, right? And then, so I might have done something like that. I don't know. That's just something to think about. But then 1, 4, and then going to 3 and a 6, because this, again, was originally going to be 1. But by taking that 1 and turning it into 2, into 3 and 6, right? Those are substitutes for 1. But it gives us that circle of fifths motion, and then that 6 chord could have moved directly into a 2 chord, and that's what I probably would have done, because the 3 chord here, 3 chord to 6, really kind of wanted to go to 2 to complete that circle of fifths, to 5, and then I love that descending bass line, using an inversion to improve the bass line. Another 3 to 6. And then again, he's going to 4, but I probably would have just let it go to 2. The advantage of 4 instead of 2 here is that, well, we're going to want the 2 a little bit later, and if this whole 4 bars here is nothing but 2 to 5, then that feels like, well, we've been having faster harmonic motion than that. How this is going to feel a little weird in comparison. But let me show you a trick here. So I'm going to play this phrase here a different way. So here's 3, 6, 2, 5, 2. Right. So what I did is back and forth between the 2 and 5. So 3, 6, 2, 5, back to 2, back to 5, to 1. That idea of saying, hey, I got 4 bars that originally was maybe just a 4 and a 5, or even just a 5. How can I make it have some motion? Back and forth between 2 and 5 will do it. We can also get 6 involved in there. Like if I went to that 2 chord here, then backed up on the circle of fifths to 2 again, to 6 again. So 2, back up to 6, and then come back to 5. That's another trick that often works. So the idea is, at some level, we know this thing is going to be a 2-5, and we're looking for tricks to expand on that. And other ways are, actually changing chord on every beat of that using pass chords. Right, so I went A flat, and then I put in a 1 chord in first inversion to create more motion. And then go to 5, and then back to 2. 5, 2, 5. Right? You can put in a lot of motion in there while still just using these same techniques. I'm not introducing new techniques. I'm just finding new ways of exploiting them. So that's kind of the lesson I want to give you here. These techniques are really good if you think about them. So again, when I asked you to keep these conflicting thoughts in your head, you can use any chord you want as long as it fits the melody. Any diatonic chord you want as long as it fits the melody is okay. And yet these techniques are really good, and they will lead us to things that are especially satisfying. So going on, coming back to 1, 5, 2, 5 to 1. Now here, he's going from 1, and he's hearing that the chord wants to change here, and he's using 3 to get to 4. Now that totally works. It's an acknowledgement that the chord that really belongs there is not a diatonic chord, right? It should have been an E flat 7 chord, I think, as far as how the original probably went. And so he's looking for a way of getting some motion into that A flat without leaving the world of diatonic chords. And so he's disciplining himself to do the thing. But let's talk about the specific choice made. So this guy here, this G minor chord, having the A flat in the melody against it is kind of unfortunate, right? It's kind of unfortunate because this clashes. That's the interval we most typically want to avoid, that minor second or minor ninth, basically, between notes. And that's the avoid tone. That's why fourths are considered avoid tones over major chords, because they create that weird half step. Some half steps sound good. Some half steps sound less good. And so this one, this half step above the chord tone, is a little sour. So it's an unfortunate fact of that melody that the thing that would have worked, because usually 1 to 3 to 4 works really well. So does 1 to 1 in first inversion to 4. That's a really common motion. But that A flat is going to be slightly problematic. If we wanted to avoid that problem and stay diatonic, I would maybe use the same trick I used on the bridge of Ash Grove. This is the 4 chord in first inversion, and second inversion, sorry. That gives us some sense of motion. It's disappointing. You hear the same thing I hear. We really want to hear a dominant set. This is what we want to hear. That's what we want to hear. We want to hear the thing that Jerome Kern probably wrote. That's what next week's lessons are going to be about, is secondary dominance. And what I will say about this is secondary dominance, I've held off on introducing them because there's so much fundamentals that I want to make sure that we have under our belt before we delve into secondary dominance. But secondary dominance open the floodgates. I mentioned something earlier about the rules for their usage being narrower. You only use them in certain places, certain ways, etc., which is true. And yet there is so much power there. So much music is written using nothing but diatonic chords and secondary dominants. I mean, you could really take like all the Bach preludes from Well-Tempered Clavier and analyze them all as nothing but diatonic chords and secondary dominants. One or two other things in there, yes, for sure. But for the most part, diatonic chords and secondary dominants give you most of Bach. I'm painting with a very broad brush, but most of Bach is diatonic chords and secondary dominants. Most pop music is diatonic chords and secondary dominants. Most of the music of these composers, Jerome Kern and so forth, these, you know, American popular song composers of the early 20th century, mid 20th century, is diatonic chords and secondary dominants with a small sprinkling of other things. Most folk music is going to be, if you have a folk song that's just not working, like that C sharp, that pesky C sharp in the Ash Grove, secondary dominant. So once we really get into secondary dominants, we're going to have more to talk about. But so I like how that, I like how this A flat approaches the G by step. I might be looking if I could exploit that more. 5 to 4 to 3, something like that, maybe, to get even more of that in there. But yeah, that's beautiful. And then 2, 5, 1. It's hard to beat a 2, 5, 1. If you can make a 2, 5 work, absolutely fits. All right. So I want to finish up this one here by looking at Colleen's Cielito Lindo. She did a couple different versions of it. One that was, so Kevin, just great job. Cielito Lindo, she did a couple of versions of it. One that was just 1, 4, and 5, and then one she went like hog wild with all sorts of jazz chords and stuff. I was like, yeah, let's keep it diatonic because that's what we're focusing on here. This is another one that's in 3/4, so it has that complication already of 3/4. Where do we put the second chord in a measure? But it's syncopated. The melody is it's a, you know, Latin American. It's a Mexican folk song. It uses a technique called hemiola right off the bat, so that it feels like it's in 2/4. If you didn't know it was in 3, by the accompaniment, the melody itself sounds like quarter, quarter, half, quarter, 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 half. You would think you were hearing 2/4. But that's because that melody note falls on beat 3, and this really throws a lot of things off in terms of our perceptions. But the same harmonic techniques are going to work. So we're going to listen to her harmonization here, and I'm going to play it because I think I'm going to play it better than MuseScore will. And yeah, did she turn off her chords? I'll let MuseScore play. All right, so yeah, again, she's choosing chords that fit the melody really well. And so when you take the part of your brain that says, if the chord fits the melody and it's diatonic, you can totally get away with it. If the voice, you will be able to make it work with voice leading, and MuseScore might be letting us down a little bit. But when we can exploit the circle of fifths, use of inversions to improve bass lines, functional substitutions, we can make things that much better. So this idea of 1 to 2 to 3, that's a common chord progression, that stepwise motion. In classical terms, it would never really go to 3, it would go to 1 in first inversion. But yeah, that sort of thing is a common thing, and it sounds nice here because the melody is supporting it nicely. And yes, it gives us parallel fifths here, but in this style, it's just not going to be an issue. Now, going from that 3 chord to the 1 chord in first inversion, I would claim isn't enough of a distinction. The 3 chord is so similar to the 1 chord in first inversion that it's almost like you didn't change anything. So I would definitely go to root position for that C chord. There's no reason for that inversion. It's not helping us any. And then I would be looking at, the thing is, I look at this next couple bars starting with a 1 chord, and 2 bars later I'm back to a 1 chord. I know from experience that 1, 6, 2, 5 would totally work, right? Anytime you're taking 2 bars to get from a 1 chord to get back to a 1 chord, we can use the circle of fifths. Back up from that 1 chord to 5, back up from the 5 to 2, back up from the 2 to 6, and then we have our 1 chord at the beginning. That's basically what I did on Ashgrove, right? I took that 5, backed it up to a 2-5, threw a 6 before it, and called it good, right? So I would not be avoiding the 1, 6, 2, 5. It's going to work, and it would totally work. And here she's using that back and forth between the 2, 5. Right? So she's using that back and forth between the 2 and the 5, and that back and forth 2, 5 is what the rest of the song does. There's a whole lot of back and forth between 2 and 5, and so she's working really hard to not just go back and forth between the 2 and the 5, because here's another 2, 5, another 2, 5, and these are all the right chords. So one of the things that she's doing is trying to say, what happens if I put in a B half diminished chord? It fits the melody. I can't fault it. I will say, it doesn't necessarily add anything in particular. We could just go back and forth between 2 and 5. There might not be a better answer than just the back and forth between the 2 and the 5, but you definitely want to try. You want to see what you can make happen, right? This version here, I'll make the same observation here about D to G. By keeping the same bass note, they don't sound as different as they otherwise would, especially because she wrote D minor 6, which has a B. Minor 6th chords have that tritone in them. Tritones are fine, but it's the tritone that the G7 is going to have. So I've made this comment before that on our 2 chord, we typically don't want to make it a minor 6th chord because it's going to make it sound too much like the 5. So between that minor 6th and the common bass tone of D, these 2 chords sound a little too similar. They're very similar. They're almost the same chord. So she's trying to avoid just going back and forth between the 2 and the 5, and yet 2 and the 5 back and forth is really kind of the right thing, actually. So I would also be struggling to find a better answer than back and forth between 2 and 5 here. So I think the things she's trying are really good, but maybe when we have other bows in our quiver. Did I say that right? I think so. That this will become that much more satisfying. All right, so I'm going to look at the rest of this piece afterwards because I know I'm going over here, and Colleen's not here right now anyhow, so I'm going to write up some comments a little bit later and think about this. But I want to thank everyone for putting in your music here. Keep doing this. This exercise right here, so vital. So if you haven't done it yet, hopefully my comments here will help you get a good start on this project so that next week when we dive into secondary dominance, you'll have a good foundation. Do this project. It will be worth it. All right? Aha, arrows in a quiver. Thank you. I knew I didn't say that right. Of course, I knew that. All right, so thanks everyone for being here. This has been Music Masterclass. Next week, as I mentioned, we'll be diving into secondary dominance, which is going to open the floodgates, as I said. Next week in the MuseCore Cafe, we will be, it'll be an Ask Me Anything session because it's the first week of the month. And so be prepared with questions to ask me about MuseScore, and I'll try to show you what I can. And thanks again for all the music. Thanks for the comments. Thanks for the questions. And I will see you next time.